You finally said it. After months, possibly years, of rearranging yourself around someone else's needs, suppressing your own reactions, and explaining away behavior that any honest reading of the situation would have flagged long ago, you drew a line. Quietly, maybe. Carefully, with more consideration for their feelings than they had ever extended toward yours. And what came back was not respect, not grudging acknowledgement, not even simple displeasure, which would have been honest and manageable. What came back was a campaign. Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil, published in 1886, that the person who cannot tolerate limits placed on them by another reveals, in that intolerance, the precise shape of what they have been taking. The boundary is not an attack. It is a withdrawal of access they had come to experience as a right. And the response to that withdrawal, the specific sequence of behaviors that follows, is not random. It is not even, in most cases, fully conscious. It is a predictable psychological operation driven by what clinical psychology calls narcissistic injury, designed to restore the access the boundary removed. There are 8 things that happen in that sequence. Understanding them, in the order they tend to arrive, is the difference between being dismantled by the campaign and watching it unfold from a position of clarity it cannot reach. If you have ever set a limit with someone and found yourself worse off for having done it, give this video a like right now, because what follows is going to explain exactly what happened and exactly what to expect next. 1. The explosion, or its precise inverse. The first response to a boundary is almost always disproportionate to the limit itself, and it arrives in one of 2 forms, both expressions of the same interior event, routed through different temperamental channels. The first form is rage, overt, immediate, and calibrated, consciously or not, to make the cost of the boundary feel higher than the cost of never having drawn it. Heinz Kohut, the psychoanalyst whose work on narcissistic injury remains foundational in clinical psychology, documented what he called narcissistic rage as the specific response to any experience the narcissistic person interprets as a challenge to their fundamental entitlement. The rage is not proportional to the offense because it is not actually responding to the offense. It is responding to the injury beneath it, the wound to a self-structure so fragile that a limit placed by another person is experienced not as a request, but as an assault on the entire edifice of who they believe themselves to be. The second form is equally revealing, total, immediate, theatrical withdrawal. The cold silence, the sudden disappearance. The performance of indifference so extreme that it communicates, more clearly than any rage could, exactly how much the boundary threatened them. Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, described this inverse response as the signature of resentment operating under pressure, the transformation of injury into composure that is designed to wound the person who set the limit by demonstrating that the limit has produced no visible effect. It is rage wearing the costume of dignity. Both are the same thing. The thermometer has changed. The temperature has not. 2. The reframing. Your boundary becomes their wound. Within hours or days of the initial response, something more sophisticated begins. The narrative shifts. The boundary you set, which was a statement about your own needs, your own limits, your own requirements for how you are treated, gets recast as something you did to them. Jennifer Freed at the University of Oregon documented this pattern in what she called DARVO: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. In its narcissistic expression, the sequence is precise. They deny that anything warranted your limit. They attack the limit itself, its fairness, its timing, your motives for drawing it. And then they reverse the positions entirely. You become the aggressor, they become the injured party, and the original harm that prompted your boundary is buried under the new narrative of what your boundary did to them. What makes this particularly effective and particularly destabilizing is that the reframing is delivered with genuine conviction. The narcissistic person is not, in most cases, consciously constructing a false narrative. They have processed the event through a self-protective architecture that genuinely experiences the limit as an attack, which means they are not lying to you. They are telling you, with complete sincerity, a story that serves them, one that has been assembled by a psychology organized around never being the one at fault. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, wrote about this as one of the defining features of the closed type. The person whose relationship to reality is fundamentally organized around the protection of a specific self-image. When reality threatens that image, the image is protected, and reality is rewritten. Your boundary is the reality that threatened the image. The reframing is the rewrite. 3. The charm offensive. If the explosion and the reframing don't restore what the boundary removed, the next phase arrives. And it is the most dangerous of the 8, precisely because it is the most pleasant. The person returns, warmer than they have been in months, more attentive, more present, more apparently genuine than at almost any previous point in the relationship. They remember things you mentioned in passing. They make gestures that demonstrate they were listening. They are, in this phase, the version of themselves that made you invest in the relationship in the first place. Clinical psychology calls this hoovering, named for the vacuum cleaner, because the function is identical, to pull you back in. It is not a return to genuine engagement. It is a tactical deployment of warmth in response to a specific threat. The warmth is real enough to feel real. The motivation behind it is the restoration of access that the boundary disrupted. Nothing more and nothing less. What makes hoovering so effective is that it presents you with the most difficult possible choice: to maintain a limit against someone who is currently giving you every reason to believe the limit is no longer necessary. They seem different. They seem to have understood. And the part of you that invested in this relationship, that wanted it to be what it sometimes appeared to be, is more than willing to be convinced. Nietzsche, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, wrote about the specific danger of warmth that arrives in response to your resistance rather than independent of it. Genuine change does not require your boundaries' removal to demonstrate itself. It demonstrates itself in behavior that is consistent regardless of what you have or haven't conceded. The charm that appears precisely when your limit threatens their access is information. It is not evidence of transformation. It is evidence that the transformation being performed is for your benefit and will last exactly as long as your boundary does. Think about the last time someone became their best self the moment you threatened to remove your availability. Comment below. I will not be hoovered back. Just that. Because the person who needs that sentence knows exactly which relationship it belongs to. 4. The smear campaign. When the charm offensive fails, when you hold the boundary through the warmth, through the gestures, through the version of them that almost made you forget why the boundary was necessary, the operation moves to a different theater. The social environment around you begins to shift. You start receiving information through the channels that such information travels, that the person has been talking, not confrontationally, conversationally, sharing their version of events, a version in which they are bewildered, hurt, trying their best, and dealing with behavior from you that the people hearing it find surprising, given how they've always spoken about you. Dasher Keltner at UC Berkeley, whose research on power dynamics documented how individuals with narcissistic profiles manage social environments, identified what he calls reputation management under threat, the systematic shaping of the social narrative around a relationship. When that relationship begins producing outcomes the high-power individual cannot control. The smear campaign is this management in its most active form. It is the preemptive discrediting of your account of events, delivered before you have offered that account, through a network of people whose sympathies have been secured by a version of the story you were not present contest. Nietzsche, in Human, All Too Human, wrote about the specific sophistication of attacks conducted through the social environment rather than directly. The recognition that the most durable damage to a person's position is done not through confrontation, but through the quiet, persistent reshaping of how others read them. The smear campaign does not defeat you. It isolates you. It ensures that when you eventually speak, the audience has already been prepared to receive your account with skepticism. 5. The guilt installation. Running parallel to the smear campaign, sometimes preceding it, sometimes following it, always present in some form, is a more intimate operation directed not at your social environment, but at your interior. The guilt installation is the process by which the narcissistic person introduces, through accumulated comment and implication, the proposition that your boundary is causing harm that you are responsible for. Their suffering, which is real because boundaries do produce discomfort in the person they limit, is presented as evidence that you have done something wrong, that a kinder person would have handled this differently, that the limit itself reflects a deficiency in your character, a coldness, a rigidity, a failure of empathy that says something unflattering about who you actually are. What makes this effective is that the suffering is genuine. The narcissistic person is not performing distress to manipulate you. They are experiencing it and channeling it outward in the only direction their psychology allows. Your guilt in response to their genuine suffering is also genuine. And that genuine guilt, the natural response of an empathetic person to evidence that someone they are connected to is in pain, is the precise resource the guilt installation is designed to extract. Nietzsche, in Aurora, described what he called the morality of pity as the primary mechanism through which the psychologically weak exert power over the psychologically strong. The person with the highest capacity for empathy becomes, in this dynamic, the person most vulnerable to having that empathy weaponized. Your guilt is not evidence that the boundary was wrong. It is evidence that you are capable of caring about the suffering of someone who has used your caring against you from the beginning. This channel exists outside the algorithm. No sponsorships, no brand deals, just research, writing, in the belief that ideas sharp enough to change how you see yourself are worth protecting. If this is giving you language for something you have been living without being able to name, consider supporting this work directly through the link in the description. Every contribution keeps this independent, and that independence is what makes this kind of honesty possible. 6. The escalation. If guilt doesn't move you, if you hold the limit through the genuine discomfort of knowing your boundary is producing suffering in someone you care about, the operation escalates. The stakes are raised, the consequences of maintaining the boundary are made larger, more explicit, more unavoidable. This escalation takes different forms depending on the specific relationship and the specific leverage available. In romantic relationships, it may be the threat of ending things, the implication that your boundary has made the relationship untenable and that the consequences of maintaining it will be permanent. In family relationships, it may be the mobilization of other family members, the introduction of the boundary into dynamics that previously had nothing to do with it, the transformation of a private limit into a family crisis. In professional relationships, it may be the leveraging of institutional power, the introduction of your boundary into performance evaluations, the suggestion that your limit is evidence of a problematic attitude rather than a legitimate need. Kipling Williams' research at Purdue on social exclusion and ego threat documented the neurological underpinnings of this escalation. When the strategies designed to restore access have failed, the psychological system that was threatened by the boundary activates increasingly extreme responses. The escalation is not a choice. It is the behavioral expression of a nervous system that has exhausted its graduated responses and is now operating in threat mode. John Gottman's research on relationship deterioration identified the specific combination that the escalation produces in the person receiving it. Contempt delivered through the content of the threats, stonewalling delivered through the refusal to engage with your perspective, and the specific combination of hostility and coldness that his research identified as most predictive of irreversible relationship damage. The escalation does not want to end the relationship. It wants to end your limit, but it is willing to threaten the former to accomplish the latter. Nietzsche, in Twilight of the Idols, wrote about this as the last resort of the will that cannot achieve its aim through legitimate means, the transformation of a relational dispute into a test of endurance in which the person with the least to lose holds the advantage. The question the escalation is asking is not whether your boundary was reasonable. It is whether you are willing to pay the price of maintaining it, and the price is being raised deliberately to the point where the answer becomes no. 7. The false concession. The escalation has a ceiling. At some point, when the threats have produced discomfort but not capitulation, when the stakes have been raised without the limit collapsing, the escalation becomes unsustainable. It requires too much visible aggression, too much explicit hostility for the person maintaining it to hold simultaneously with the self-image they need to protect. And so the concession arrives. They acknowledge, in some form, that they went too far, that the escalation was excessive, that they understand your boundary better now and are committed to respecting it. The language is the language of accountability. The structure is the structure of a resolution. What it is not is a concession. It is a tactical retreat designed to lower your guard far enough that the campaign can resume from a position of closer access. The acknowledgement is real enough to sound genuine. The commitment is specific enough to seem credible. And the relief you feel at the apparent resolution, the release of the sustained tension that the campaign has been producing, is enough to lower the vigilance that maintained the boundary through everything that preceded this moment. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, described this as one of the most sophisticated operations available to the person who cannot achieve dominance through direct means, the performance of surrender as a strategy for gaining ground. The false concession does not end the campaign. It relocates it from the phase of overt pressure to the phase of quiet erosion, in which the boundary is respected just enough that you don't reinstate your defenses and violated just enough that the limit gradually loses the clarity it had when it was first drawn. 8. The slow erosion. This is the final phase, and the one most likely to succeed if the previous 7 have failed, not because it is more powerful than what preceded it, because it is more patient. The boundary that survived the explosion, the reframing, the charm offensive, the smear campaign, the guilt installation, the escalation, and the false concession now faces its most durable opponent, time and incrementalism. The violations that begin in this phase are small enough to be individually dismissible. Each one taken alone is arguably within the territory of what might be forgiven. What has changed is that they arrive in a continuous sequence. A sequence specifically designed to move the line of what you consider a violation far enough that the original boundary no longer exists, without any single moment in which the crossing was unambiguous enough to justify a response. This is the mechanism Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, identified as the most durable form of power over another person. Not the power that announces itself through force, but the power that operates through the gradual normalization of what was once unacceptable. The boundary does not get broken, it gets relocated, millimeter by millimeter, interaction by interaction, until the person who drew the original line is living somewhere significantly beyond it without being able to point to the moment when the crossing occurred. Epictetus, in the Enchiridion, made the observation that applies most precisely here. A principle maintained inconsistently is a principle that has been abandoned. The boundary that bends in response to accumulated pressure was not held. It was managed. And management, in the presence of someone organized around its removal, is a form of surrender on a longer timeline. Now the part that requires everything. Because there is something this video has been building toward that is more important than any of the 8 things it has described. You cannot outmaneuver this campaign through cleverness. You cannot negotiate with it through reasonableness. You cannot soften it through additional understanding of why the person running it is the way they are. All of those responses, and you have likely tried most of them, engage with the campaign on its own terms, which means they are already operating inside a framework that was designed by someone with significantly more practice at this particular game than you have. What Nietzsche's philosophy actually recommends, and what Marco Aurelius's Meditations confirms through an entirely different tradition, is something that sounds simpler than it is. Locate what is yours, and govern that. Your boundary is yours. The campaign against it belongs entirely to the person running it. The explosion, the reframing, the charm, the smear, the guilt, the escalation, the false concession, the erosion. None of these are about you. They are about access. They are the behavioral expression of a psychology that has encountered an obstacle and is cycling through its available responses until one of them removes the obstacle. Your limit is the obstacle, and the only thing that removes the campaign is the sustained, undramatic, undefended maintenance of the thing the campaign is designed to remove. Not because you are stronger than the campaign. Because you have stopped requiring the campaign to be something other than what it is. 2 questions for the comments. First, which of these 8 phases has been most effective against you? The one that has historically produced the capitulation that reset the cycle? Second, what would change in your capacity to hold your limits if you understood completely that every phase of this campaign is organized around access rather than around anything that is actually true about you? Leave it below. The specific answers are the ones that reach the people who need them, and if this kind of examination, the precise, unflinching mapping of what happens when you try to protect yourself from someone who has organized their psychology around your not doing so, is work you want to continue, subscribe. Because the next video goes into territory that connects directly to what this one opened. The boundary was not the problem. It was the diagnosis. And what it diagnosed tells you everything you need to know about what comes next.